I'm delighted to be chairing this panel. It's a subject very close to my heart and one that I'm sure you will all have lots of views on as well. Now, we hear a lot of discussion around Brexit, about the opportunities, the policies, but what about the raw politics? Where is Britain now? Where is our political map post-Brexit? Where is British politics? And most importantly, where are the voters? Because it does feel that quite seismic shifts seem to happen in our... We used to have 24-hour news cycles, but I'm sure Sam will attest to this. Sometimes they feel like sort of 24-second news cycles at the moment. Things feel like they're changing very, very quickly, particularly when you look at the currents and the headlines. But actually, where are things structurally in terms of where the voters are? And we've got a panel of real experts. We're probably not going to have a general election very soon, but we do have local elections coming up. And I know in previous panels you were discussing the prospect of perhaps a progressive alliance, or will there be a kind of a realignment of British politics? So let's crunch through all of that. We've got a brilliant, brilliant panel for you. We have Paula Surridge, who's Deputy Director of UK in A Changing Europe. We have Sam Coates, Deputy Political Editor at Sky News. You will know him from popping up, looking quite flustered sometimes. And I called him, what did I describe you earlier as a profound rascal, but I think that's a good thing to be in terms of British political coverage. Delighted to have Kelly Beaver, Chief Executive of Ipsos UK, and delighted to have Professor Jeff Evans, Professor of the Sociology of Politics at Nuffield College, Oxford University. So we're going to hear from our panellists first. We're going to hear from Paula first, then Kelly, then Jeff, then Sam. As ever, we want to hear from you as well. Get your contributions in, which of course we're doing via the Slido. And so I figured out how to use that. That's all going to work very seamlessly. And I think the real big question, that this was the exam question that we're putting here, is, do we think... We had quite a strict narrative, I think, in the run-up to the 2019 general election, that it wasn't so much a question of whether you were left-wing or right-wing. Brexit did seem to be quite a defining characteristic of the voter. Is that still the case now? And have we seen big, significant and lasting structural changes in terms of how we vote and why we vote post-Brexit? So, Paula, over to you first.
Thank you. Should I just have
Yes, you take the clicker.
So thank you. This morning we heard a lot about how, actually perhaps not as much as we expected about Brexit, but how our political parties have changed. And in this session we want to switch the focus and look at the voters instead. And if we ask that question, how have voters changed, there's really two types of answer that we could give. And the first looks at long-term social trends, how the voters have changed socially. So our ageing population, internal migration, changes in the occupational structure. I'm sure, as Jeff has written about, the kind of shrinking size of the working class and the importance of that. For me, though, I think one of the most consequential changes that we've seen for a whole host of public policy and political domains has been a really rapid increase in the proportion of the population who experience higher education. We are a much, much more educated electorate now than we were 2 or 3 decades ago. Alongside those social changes, though, the referendum also fed two processes that I would argue were already happening in British politics, but the referendum kind of supercharged them. The first of those was a disconnection between parties and the public, so people are much less likely to say they identify with a political party, to do so strongly, but also alongside that a certain amount of distrust in politics and politicians, so not just a disconnection from the parties, but also disengagement, and a fragmentation of the electorate, where, as Aisha just alluded to, we used to imagine that we could explain our politics in terms of left-right positions. And we've seen a period where people's political views about cultural or social issues became as important as their economic views. And this drives this process of fragmentation. You get quite distinctive groups within the electorate, depending on how they are formed of those two different sets of values. So the British electorate had been becoming less strongly connected to political parties for at least 2 decades before Brexit. We'd seen this in earlier elections in terms of the rise of, I'll just use other parties because third doesn't always quite cut it when there's a fourth and a fifth in some cases. And in terms of increased volatility, people were more likely to switch their vote, they were more likely to move between voting and non-voting, and we'd seen declining turnout in elections. All that was happening before Brexit, but I think Brexit further undermined those connections because the referendum campaign was fought across party lines. So your party identity was very little help to you in deciding how to vote in the referendum because you'd got large characters on both sides campaigning on both sides. So you couldn't use your party identity to perform the kind of shortcut that perhaps it had used to do. And I think this helped to weaken those ties to parties still further. I've recently, as any of you have followed the polling very closely, there's been an awful lot of talk about the don't knows recently and the Conservative 2019 vote moving to the don't knows. So I went to the election panel study thinking I might be able to learn something about the don't knows by looking at how their behaviours changed across them, and you might see a blog on that in the next couple of weeks. But the thing that really jumped out at me was that the highest proportion of don't knows across all the waves going back to 2014 occurs in the wave immediately after the Brexit referendum. So that's when people were most uncertain how to resolve the tensions between Brexit positions and party positions. The second process that the Brexit vote tapped into is what I've already spoken about here, this second dimension of values that were already important in the period, certainly from the 2005 election and in the 2015 election, but which also cut across the economic left-right divide. At the aggregate level, you can't, the two are uncorrelated. Jeff designed the scale, so he can tell you this much better than I can. But the two are not correlated together at the aggregate level. So you can't predict someone's position on social and cultural issues from their position on economic issues. And this process was also happening before Brexit, but Brexit supercharged it. And these things all connect together with the social changes that were happening. So we know across many academic studies that those who experience higher education are on average more socially liberal than those who don't. We do not agree on why that's the case, and we could argue about that for 2 more panels at least. But we know that it happens, and we know it's not something that's unique to the UK. So what I'd like to do, just a couple of minutes, is somebody decided I needed my slide already, which was very kind of them. Confused now if I'm controlling that by my mind, is I'd just like to show you a couple of slides to illustrate these two processes and how they played out in the 2019 election. So this is looking at vote by education level. It's taken from the British Election Study Random Probability Survey, not the internet panel. So has better reach, particularly amongst non-voters or those with low political attention. And for that reason, I've left in here a grey part of the bar to show you turnout amongst these education groups. Because I think when we talk about education effects in politics, a large amount of what we're talking about is a turnout effect, and we miss it completely. We very rarely actually take that into account. And if you're interested, quick plug, you can read more about turnout in my chapter with Phil Cowley in the report that was on people's seats earlier on. But the point I want to show you here is if you look at that group with no qualifications, the least well-educated group, around half of that group did not turn out to vote in the 2019 election. If you break that down further by age and look at those in the youngest age group, so say 18 to 30-year-olds with no qualifications, that rises well above 50%. It's reaching up towards 70% of young people without qualifications who do not turn out to vote. So when we talk about education effects, it's really important, I think, that we also talk about turnout effects. You might find it a surprise on here, given everything we've heard about education effects, to see that the Conservative vote is actually pretty similar across these different groups. It's not as dramatic as you might have expected in terms of differences for the Conservatives, partly a result of the 2019 election itself and the Conservatives doing relatively well, but also partly because what we see is the postgraduates and the undergraduates, the postgraduates in particular, are distinctive. And that's another process that we miss sometimes when we talk about education effects. We've had a big increase in the proportion of undergraduates. We've also had an explosion in the number of postgraduates. And that's something else. It doesn't get picked up quite yet in surveys, but it will do as that as those groups age and go through. And it's the postgraduates who are actually most distinctive in terms of their voting behaviour, particularly likely to vote Lib Dem. And I think that's, again, a question for another panel as to why the very highly educated are particularly likely to vote for the Lib Dems. Secondly, I can do it myself this time, I won't do it with the power of my mind. If we divide the electorate into groups based on their economic and social positions, then we can see a really dramatic change has emerged on the left of the left-right scale. For the simplicity of the slide, I've only focused on voters who are economically on the left. That comprises almost half of the population, actually, which people do find surprising. And what I've got here is the 1997 election and the 2019 election. I've taken 1997 as the comparator, but we could easily take 1992 and show very similar things. You actually would show quite similar things in 2001 as well. It begins to change between 2005 and 2010 and continues across. If you look at that 1997 data and the big red bars there, that's the proportion of those on the left in each of these other values groups defined by social values who voted Labour. In 1997, if you were on the left economically, it did not matter what your other values were. There was a majority, a large majority, that voted Labour. You can see those red bars are more or less flat. Look at the 2019 data. By 2019, it's just no longer true. And in fact, amongst those on the left who held what I've labelled here authoritarian, on a kind of liberal authoritarian dimension,
Sorry, can we just explain that?
I can explain it, yeah, sorry. I'm so used to talking about it, I just assume everybody knows what it is. So that's a dimension that looks at people's social attitudes. It's got questions like attitudes to the death penalty, attitudes to whether or not children should be taught to obey authority, tolerance for different groups and so on, make up part of that scale. So there's a liberal end to it, an authoritarian end. And I know if there's any political psychologists in the audience, just don't shout at me. I know you don't want it to be called authoritarian. But by 2019, the Conservatives are winning more of that group. These are people who are all on the left economically, but the Conservatives are dominant in that group in 2019. It's not new in 2019, it was happening from at least 2010. So just to conclude, I think the referendum fed these two processes that were already happening in British politics. I think if you go and look at the report in particular, all the chapters in their own way highlight the wide-ranging ramifications of the acceleration of those trends and what they've meant for our politics, and then how they have gone on to interact with a global pandemic. So we've had the acceleration of these trends, and you'll see in the report, COVID doesn't map onto this very easily, so we've got quite a complex picture now.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent. So next we're going to have Kelly from Ipsos, and you're going to talk us through your data.
That's right. Can I get the clicker? Because
you're not going to use your mind.
My mind is not as magic as Paula's. But so first of all, thanks for having me along today. I'm going to share with you some of the data that we hold, where we've pulled together all of our political monitor data per annum. And you can have a look at how some of the big trends in what matters to voters has shifted over time. The two dynamics I'm going to look at today, one is class and how important class is or is not and how that has changed over time. And then secondly, having a look at Brexit identity and how that aligns with party identity. And then I'll give you a little bit on what's going on in politics at the minute, perhaps, as well. So firstly, just on class voting intentions, as Paula mentioned, some of these issues, they've been fading away over time as a core issue on which the electorate voting lines could be distilled. Age, but also education, as Paula covered, have become preeminent in the divide in politics in the UK. And also on the identity point, which I'll come to, the realignment on the identity does appear from the data to be relatively durable. Both parties held the same proportion of Leave Remain voters in 2021-ish as they did in 2019. So those are some real fundamental shifts in how vote make-up and vote share aligns to party vote share. So just having a look, as I said, this is from Political Monitor. It's the last remaining large-scale telephone voting intention poll that's done in the UK. The majority are online. As Paula mentioned, there's also the British Elections Study. And just looking at this data, what you can see is back in 1992, which is a year, again, we've aggregated all of this, you can see a very traditional, clear picture The X-shaped pattern that you see on the left-hand side here shows the middle classes strongly leaning Conservative, whilst Labour was really the party of the working classes. That is how things were, the traditional way. By 2019, which was, as we know, a very good year for the Conservative Party, they had raised their vote share amongst the socioeconomic DE categories and maintained their traditional lead in the ABs and the C1s, which, as we know, are our upper middle class voters. In 2020, we see that this pattern completely inverted. This was a major watershed moment. You can see Labour ahead amongst the ABs and the C1s, and Conservatives now leading in the C2s and the DEs, the sort of lower socioeconomic categories. But it tells us something much more important as well. It tells us that both parties are now competitive across Britain's traditional class divides. And it speaks to the importance now, as Paula alluded to as well, of the identity issues like Brexit, rather than more materialistic issues like class or income, which, as I set out at the beginning, makes class no longer really a preeminent political divide in Britain, and the shift towards both age and education. And the second point I just wanted to pick up on, which is covered in the report, the fabulous report put out by Paula and her team earlier today, is looking a little bit at Brexit identity and how this still exists. So again, we've aggregated the data, 27,000-ish responses, and looked at it in an annual snapshot, so you can have a look at how this breaks down. But in the Brexit divide, we saw in 2019, general election result, and it's been replicated here. This is the 2021 numbers. And if you just have a look at how that breaks out, those of you in the room who will remember how 2019 looked, this is incredibly similar. So we have 7 and 10-ish Leave supporters saying that they would vote Tory in 2021. 1 in 5 would vote Labour. That is very similar. But it's not a totally clear-cut divide. And I think in 2021, the fact that we have 1 in 5 Remain voters saying they would vote Conservative and 1 in 5 Leave voters saying their vote Remain, or Labour, sorry, it tells you really there's a significant minority in both parties supporting the cuts against the grain on the general party view on Europe, and how complex some of these coalitions are going forward. The other and the final point that I wanted to make really is one about the current political context, because the Conservative Party vote, this is vote share I show you on this, the Conservative Party vote has been seeing a steady decline since around the summer of 2021. And it's very clear that for voters in our issues index as well, that Brexit is not the top issue anymore. It's number 5 or 6. It has way down the pecking order in terms of the NHS, the economy, COVID. Other issues are now stepping into the fore. And the voters who voted for Boris Johnson back in 2019 and his political party, they are worried about competence of government. They are worried about trust in government and the establishments. And they are worried about other broader issues facing society in the UK today. So it is an interesting context in which we have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kelly, really interesting. I was actually going to ask, I scribbled down my questions, do voters still care as much about Brexit now? And you've answered that question, but I've got some other questions to come back on. But do please use the Slido. And I'm hoping somebody will come and show me how to use the Slido as well, which would be a slight occupational hazard. So do put your questions in there. Professor Jeff Evans, to you next.
Thanks very much. So, yes, I'm not presenting any slides. I'm just going to try and follow on from what the other speakers have just said so well by focusing on quite recent potential changes and the implications perhaps for political competition from this point on. As we've just seen, the Brexit divide was solid in terms of party support. The summer of 2021, we've run models using the British Election Study panel data, and it's like you get 80%, it's slightly more pronounced perhaps over there, 80% of Leave voters vote Tory and 10% vote Labour. And pretty much the same. Maybe it's 78-12. It's pretty much the same as it was back in 2019. This was back in last summer. So that's very solid. In terms of movement between parties, Brexit doesn't predict individual level change over time. So between 2019 and 2021, if you want to understand why people move from Labour to Conservative, or vice versa. Brexit looked like it might predict it unless you include Boris Johnson in your model. And then that dominates it. Brexit disappears into insignificance. So what Brexit is a relatively stable bloc that's been sorted. We've seen the sorting of voters, Leave Remain voters, and also to some degree working class and middle class and various educational grades. Those people have all sorted between 2015, effectively, and 2019-20. And so we have an electoral system in which the Conservatives have more support amongst the less well-educated and the working class, and obviously Leave voters, and Labour the opposite. So that's quite big news in British electoral politics, as actually Paul was elaborating with respect to the change in emphasis on values, which I would tend to now call social conservatism and social liberalism rather than the liberal authoritarian I did back in 1990, to be honest. But if you talk to a psychologist about that, they have a breakdown, it's fair to say. So we've seen the sorting, and so it's a different pattern. What's happened since? You see, because obviously in the last few months, we've seen a lot of chaos and nightmare for the Conservatives. You've seen, in effect, Boris, who was incredibly important from every analysis I've done in winning the Conservatives a big majority in 2019, by his appeal specifically to Brexit Party voters. He was as popular with them as Nigel Farage was, well before he became Conservative Party leader, almost as popular. So that's quite it was an amazingly useful strategic weapon to clear off that right-wing problem for the Conservative Party. And that was obviously very important for them in terms of maximising votes and seats in that election. And what we've seen, of course, is he's he's lost a fair amount of his lustre in recent months. And we know that liking Brexit and liking Boris were very closely linked. But Boris was actually, if anything, more important in some ways. So what's happened because of that decline in Boris's popularity? We might expect to have seen a real drop in support for the Conservatives, especially amongst certain sorts of voters. Well, what we have seen is we've seen there's been a drop, but there's only a 5 or 6% lead for Labour now at this point in the electoral cycle, in the middle of massive fuel crisis, careering inflation, a sleaze stroke, whatever you want to call the Partygate types of crisis. Labour are only 5 points ahead. Boris's popularity has dropped through the floor, but Labour's lead is minimal. And I say that because I think there are various problems facing Labour which make it quite difficult for them, even with these events of late. The evidence suggests that we're not going to see a resorting or a reverse sorting, as it were, like going back to working class supporting Labour and middle class supporting Conservatives, etc. Because the dropping in support for the Conservatives is general. So what we see is like Leave voters and Remain voters dislike the Conservatives now. Working class people as well as middle class people dislike the Conservatives now, but they're not more so. They're just fairly general patterns of disillusion currently. So the sorting is basically staying as it is, which is whether it stays like that isn't clear. But I don't think it's necessarily going to be a problem for understanding what might happen next. Labour have a real problem, and one of them is that, and not a lot of people know this, but in 2019, Corbyn's Labour won 1.15 million more votes in England and Wales than Tony Blair's Labour Party won in 2005. To some degree, mainly, this was about turnout. But even if you take into account turnout and population change, it's still 1.7% more for Labour in 2019 than 2005 in England and Wales. Obviously, Scotland has become a very different electoral system during those two periods. Now, part of the problem for Labour there is the way that the votes are clustered, and the Tories have benefited somewhat from stealing lots of seats relatively effectively and efficiently from former Labour-held areas with, clusters of working class and less well-educated voters. Now, unless they can actually reverse that sort of relationship between seats and votes in some way, then they're going to be in quite a lot of trouble regardless of what they do. They're 5 points ahead of Conservatives now, maybe 6. in 1994, 2 years after the 1992 election, it was around the time of the death of John Smith and the election of Tony Blair, they were 20 to 25 points ahead of the Conservatives. A few months after Blair's election, they were 30 points ahead of the Conservatives. So that's the very different situation we're seeing then. And that was at a period when the Conservatives had seen the ERM crisis and the Black Wednesday. We were seeing during those years quite a lot of sleaze scandals. It's got certain features of reminiscence with what we're seeing in this era. The difference is that Labour were 5 times further ahead than they are now. And clearly, probably we would say that the setup of the constituencies and the distribution of Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat votes was better then as well. So, regardless of what happens, Conservatives, I think Labour have got a massively uphill struggle to make any inroads, especially to make inroads probably with working class voters who Keir Starmer, whatever his qualities, is probably not the most appealing of candidates for. I mean, that's a guess. But I know that Boris was. Every time I've ever looked at Boris, he managed to cut through on that one. So we got that difficulty for Labour based on both where the votes are and where they are in terms of the popularity now. And it does seem to suggest there's been a decoupling between leadership evaluations and voting intention. Because basically, if they'd followed Boris on a downward slope, the Conservatives would be in a far worse state now than they actually are. What I do think it points to is that the economy is going to be decisive. I think it's going to be back to what used to be called valence politics back in the noughties, when it was all about who's running the economy efficiently and are they competent generally, and that's, as we get inflation, massive fuel rises, probably the levelling up agenda is going to be more symbolic than anything. It's going to be a matter of, can the Conservatives get lucky with what happens in the next few years in terms of growth and inflation, or not? Now, so I'm suggesting that we're seeing a change back to a politics of 20 years ago, perhaps, following a realignment because of Brexit, effectively. As Paula said, Brexit wasn't the only thing. Brexit was a sort of catalyst. It gave it that extra leap. We'd seen these changes evolving, but nobody really represented the voters who voted to leave very effectively, which is one of the things that UKIP obviously had a big impact on. So that's my updating, as it were, of all the work done by others too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. That was really interesting. And do keep your questions coming. Actually, Ollie, do you mind coming up here? I think there's a bit of an issue with the Slido. Sam, over to you now. And we've had 3 really interesting presentations from a data point of view, from a sort of an academic point of view. You're on the ground, you're talking to politicians, you're out talking to voters as well. I suppose to go back to the fundamental exam question here, do you think there have been structural changes in how Britain votes since Brexit?
I think that Brexit played an overwhelming part in the 2019 general election, but I think it's a very good and open question as to exactly what happens next. And revisiting, I think, this question of how Britain votes and why Britain votes, I mean, there isn't a better time to do it. It would just take you back to why Brexit was so important in the last general election. So if you remember the backdrop of the December 2019 general election, you had months and months of paralysis, a change of Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister in that Parliament, 2 successive Prime Ministers, couldn't get their Brexit deals through. And so there was a hue and a cry to get Brexit done from some, and then from others there was a growing chorus of people who wanted a second referendum. So the sort of the backdrop, the context at the point at which the general election in 2019 was called was all about Brexit. And at Sky we decided at that point to call it the Brexit election, and came in for some flack, but I think in time both the results and the way that the campaign turned out, I think broadly vindicated that decision, because there were 2 massive moments in that 2019 general election that I think helped changed the way that the structure of the vote happened. The first was fairly early on. You may remember Nigel Farage's Brexit party that had been holding successive prime ministers' feet to the fire over the type of Brexit that they were going to deliver. And Nigel Farage, at the very start of the campaign, was threatening to stand Brexit party candidates in every single Westminster seat. And there was a point a couple of weeks in where he decided only to stand against in seats where there wasn't an incumbent Conservative. And that was a massive moment, possibly the biggest moment of the campaign, but it meant it was much easier for Conservatives to hang on to their vote. It was going to be much harder for Labour or Lib Dems to see the, as it were, centre-right vote split, and it was going to make it much harder for them to win. At that point, the Liberal Democrats' kind of justification for being one of the parties that led the way to call an election crumbled, and it became very difficult for them then on in. So Brexit was fundamental to the first key turning point. And the second key turning point, in the view of strategists, certainly on the Tory side and some on the Labour side, was the other big moment, was when Jeremy Corbyn was pushed in one of the later debates whether or not he would remain in a second referendum, and he said he would remain neutral in such a question, throwing back to the actions of previous prime ministers. But at that point, that was weaponised by the Conservatives and helped Tory strategists believe drive more votes into their arms, or at least from their perspective away from Labour. And then on election night, when we were all doing our election night programmes, I think one of the things that you saw was the Conservative Party making gains in areas that were heavily dominated by Brexit vote, and those sorts of constituencies, but you didn't see that kind of pattern replicated amongst the Labour Party and Remain areas, because the Brexit vote piles up in the Remain vote piles up in certain areas, whereas the Brexit vote was a bit more evenly spread, I think. So that was the 2019 general election, and I think by outlining that, you can hear why the issue of Brexit could well have ended up being quite particular to that election. Those circumstances aren't going to be the circumstances of the 2023 or 2024 general election, because many of those forces, many of those questions have now been resolved, or at least moved on. And it's I've spent some time trying to think through what the 2023-2024 campaign might look like. Now, this is obviously complete guesswork based on some conversations, but a lot of just sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations. But you can see, if the Conservative Party is still led by Boris Johnson, that, as you hear him say now, and people are already road testing election arguments, the Conservative campaign will be based on the case of getting Brexit done and on the vaccine rollout. Two of the core messages that Boris Johnson is very keen to deliver, even today, even in these turbulent times. They were the messages that he was using to get him through some of the recent difficulties. The question is whether or not Labour choose to take those head on, whether or not they unpick the argument about getting Brexit done, which they may not choose to do, because Keir Starmer doesn't necessarily want to fight and suggest he's on the other side of the argument from the Conservative Brexit position too loudly, because he has to maintain a electoral coalition of his own, and the extent to which the vaccine rollout can be turned into a Brexit issue. Is there a degree to which Boris Johnson can make the case that Labour wanted to sign up to the European Medicines Agency and sort of hint that might have hindered our vaccine rollout, which was done on a national basis? Of course, there isn't a direct link between the vaccines rollout and the European Medicine Agency membership, but occasionally you do hear that argument being levelled by some Conservatives. The two other, I think, big issues in the next general election, likely to be the union. I think that we have a particularly turbulent period coming up in Northern Ireland, but of course Northern Ireland, the main political parties don't stand and don't get elected in Northern Ireland. So in some senses, in electoral math terms, that's a side issue. But I think Scotland and the future of the union and the future of Scottish independence will remain big on the equation. Labour, of course, coming from so far behind after the 2019 general election that it would be just very difficult, as Jeff was outlining, in order to get an overall majority, particularly if the Scottish Nationalist Party continue to win seats in the numbers that they have done in previous elections, including in the 2019 general election. At that point, of course, Boris Johnson likely, if it is him, to rerun the arguments that we've seen ever since 2015, where the question will be put to the Labour leader, if there is a deal to be done with the Scottish Nationalists, or you want them simply to support you in power, is there explicit, implicit kind of relationship between that and a potential path towards a referendum on Scottish independence. So I think the union's going to be a big part of that, but that's not necessarily connected to Brexit. And I think the other argument that the Conservatives will run will be on levelling up, and there clearly will not have been necessarily massive, monumental progress on levelling up by the point of the next election. So the argument there would be one that they need to be re-elected into power to get the job done. I think Labour's election campaign will focus, again, as Jeff was saying, sort of cost of living, much more traditional issue there, tax and spend, NHS and spending, and on trust. And believability of the politicians in power for all of those reasons. But Boris Johnson is a figure uniquely linked to Brexit because of the role that he played in 2016 and because of the way that he's conducted his politics ever since. There is, of course, a question about whether or not he remains in power, and the arguments about why he may stay or why he may go remain balanced. You've still got big problems for Boris Johnson in terms of what happens with the police inquiry, what happens with the Sue Gray report, whether or not he's fixed the fundamental problems that we were seeing even before Christmas with his administration. But then you have sort of structural problems with where Labour are. Well, first of all, you've got structural problems with the potential successors. I think there is no settled successor to Boris Johnson in the eyes of Conservative MPs that play a big role in selecting a successor. Some doubts in some quarters about Rishi Sunak, but no certainty over which of the alternatives might turn out best. So if the Conservative Party do choose to, as it were, throw the dice and open up a competitive sort of round in order to work out who would replace Boris Johnson, I couldn't tell you who would succeed at that point. But nor is it necessarily the case that Boris Johnson would drag down the Conservative vote at the next general election. Some people do not regard the way that he has run government as being particularly competent, and that will be a matter for debate at the next general election. But I think that a lot of commentators, including on the Labour side, would give Boris Johnson credit for the way that he conducted the 2019 general election campaign, the way he conducted the 2019 leadership campaign, the way he conducted the 2016 referendum. And the bottom line is that when it comes to campaign time, Boris Johnson is a uniquely disciplined politician, able to deliver messages very clearly in lots of different ways, often that are quite engaging. This is different from the kind of job that you have to do day to day as Prime Minister, but it is something that he has proved at the ballot box to have been previously successful at, and that's another reason why I think Tory MPs are pausing for thought. A couple of other sort of challenges on the Labour side. When you look at the polling, from space you see two big challenges that Keir Starmer has to overcome. The first is the issue I sort of alluded to in Scotland. Can the Labour Party claw back any of the support that they've lost to the SNP, that support that really got them over the line in some of those elections in 1997 and 2001 and 2005, but since has enabled the SNP to do so well. And that in turn has helped, up until this point, Conservatives to get into Downing Street. The other, I think, big electoral challenge, and I'd be really interested to hear from the rest of the panel, is when I look at the data, for instance, the YouGov data, and you look at the division by age, and you look at the over 65s, for instance, you've got a ratio of people voting Tory to Labour, so a demographic that goes to the ballot box, of about 2.5 to 1. And Boris Johnson has been incredibly effective under the radar all the way along his premiership in ensuring that people in that demographic do incredibly well at the expense of Labour. So yes, there's been some shift in the opinion polls, but the headline voting intention rate does fluctuate, and actually some of the bigger lessons to be learned are the ones that are buried a bit further down the data, but are deliver much clearer signals, as it were, as to where bits of the country are. So, sort of in conclusion, it couldn't be a more exciting point to be a political journalist, because I genuinely don't know what's going to happen next. I'm very, very pleased not to be a pollster, because I don't know what's going to happen next. And I would want to be an academic looking back on this period, maybe at some point in the future, but not yet.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. Okay, some brilliant presentations there, and thanks very much. You've got the Slido working, which is very good. Lots of questions coming through. Loads of questions actually about something that Sam picked up on, subject close to my heart, and that is Scotland. A lot of people are messaging in questions about Scotland. I'm first going to put this to Paula and to Kelly. A couple of people saying, why didn't you put SNP in your presentations? Because they are a really important part of this story. Kelly, I'll come to you first. And what do you think about the situation in Scotland?
So I think on one of the challenges that the current Conservative Party faces in Scotland, which is written large across all of the polling, is the unpopularity of Boris Johnson. He's even more unpopular, even more untrusted, and so that comes across in all of the data that we look at for Scotland. This is our political monitor data, and I displayed it as I normally display it, but it is a valid and interesting point.
Paula, what do you think about the Scottish situation and the Scottish dynamic in all of this?
So I'm going to kind of throw this question forward to the next panel, as it were, because the reason I don't show SNP in many of my breakdowns, I collapse them into other, is because to analyse that vote you need a specific Scottish sample, and the sample sizes are not big enough in the surveys that I'm working with. However, colleagues speaking on the next panel do have that data.
Stay for the next panel.
And will be able to tell you much more about Scotland than I can. So I think rather than try and say some very vague things now, it would be better if that one was answered in the next panel.
Okay. That's a good politician's answer, Paula. Very good. Jeff, on the Scottish question, Sam made the point, and I remember this very painfully when I was working for Ed Miliband. Sam's already laughing at this, in the 2015 general election campaign. Of course, when it was like, if you vote Ed Miliband, you're going to get Alex Salmond in his pocket. Do you think that attack line from the Conservatives on Labour would, and it was very powerful, that attack line, and I think it was actually something that we felt did substantially swing things, certainly when we were outdoor knocking. Do you think that kind of attack would still be very, very powerful for the Conservatives and very wounding for Labour?
In terms of their votes in England and Wales? Or
Yeah, if there was any kind of suggestion that a deal might be done.
I've not really researched it. I don't know how many people in England care that much about Scottish separation, to be honest. It's an elite issue, without doubt, but I'm not sure that most people are that fussed. So, yeah, maybe not. But I'm not an expert on the data on what the English think of this issue.
What do you think,
The English care less about it than the Scottish, and it's the same issue in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, there are groups very exercised about remaining part of the UK. And English people don't really care whether the Northern Irish remain part of the UK. So I think it is as you may have expected, Jeff.
Yeah.
Sam, what do you think? Do you think it would be as sort of pronounced an attack now, or do you think people have moved on?
So I think narrowly, I would agree with you two that the English don't necessarily give a great deal of thought to, for instance, Scottish devolution, but that wasn't quite the impact of what the Conservatives did in 2015. What David Cameron and the Conservative campaign were telling people was that if you elected Ed Miliband, he wasn't properly in charge. He wasn't in control of the Tories. He wasn't a prime minister in the way that you might think of traditional prime ministers, because he had this force, which they painted quite darkly, pulling his strings. And so it wasn't a question of the English worrying about Scottish devolution. It was a question about whether or not Ed Miliband would be representing the people that were voting for him. And that idea, I thought, was quite powerful, and that was the idea I suspect that you on the doorstep were getting played back to you.
Well, we noticed it. I mean, at the start of the short campaign, people were quite positive. 3 weeks later, after that poster came out, it really turned, and it came up on the doorstep.
So it isn't about what people think about Scotland. It's about whether or not you basically have a prime minister who's properly in charge. And so I don't know whether it's going to. I would suspect that the Tories will try and run that argument again. What I am conscious of is I haven't heard in public a way that even, 7 years after the 2015 campaign, I've not heard, and I'm willing to be corrected, but a really good Labour response to that. So in 7 years, they haven't come up with a good, either a slogan or an argument as to why that's not something that voters should be concerned about. I can see a world in which questions around the union more generally get more tricky for the Conservatives as we have a very, very unpredictable situation in Northern Ireland with the potential for a Sinn Féin First Minister and it being unclear what happens after that, after the May elections, coupled with all the debate around the Northern Ireland Protocol and whether or not we trigger Article 16. And I won't go down that rabbit hole, but Northern Ireland's element of the union might be quite tricky. And so the Tories might judge that it's not a path that they want to go down particularly, but I sort of think that they probably will do. And until Keir Starmer has a good single line to rebut that, and then a good argument in a speech to rebut that, and makes it clear why people shouldn't worry about, about that, I think that's quite important, because I have this sense from the way that people talk that you can, despite the experiences of the coalition 2010 to 2015, which could have been if you'd taken all those forces and mixed them up, and Nick Clegg pulling the strings of David Cameron for 5 years, people got used to the idea of the coalition and didn't present it as that, but they could have done. But we have a very particular view in this country, which is not shared in countries like Germany, about majority government and a prime minister being all powerful. We're often, as a nation, unwilling to confront the limits of power nationally, internationally, and in other in other ways. And we like to imagine, as a population, that a prime minister has unfettered power, and that's not actually constitutionally true. But I think that an attack on that can often work.
Okay. Thanks very much. Lots of questions on Scotland there, but I want to move on to another area, and there's a couple of questions which are themed around this. Kelly, you sort of answered the question that I had been pondering, I think many of the audience had as well, which was, do voters still care about Brexit as much? And you said, no, it's sort of come down in the list. So my question, and this is picked up by a few other people that have messaged in as well, is, does that mean it's right for Keir Starmer to say that he doesn't want to sort of keep hammering Brexit and relitigate Brexit? He's made it very clear in the last couple of weeks, a number of interventions, that he doesn't want to rejoin the EU. Now, that has caused some anger from within his own side and people on the sort of progressive alliance. But does that make sense to you?
I think there's an argument to be had that, and Sam, you touched on this a little bit when you talked about how the next election will be fought in 2023, 2024. There is an argument that the conversations will have moved on substantively by then. And the big challenges I think will face our government at that point will be linked to the economy, a bit on whether they've delivered on growth, which is something that people still would believe Conservatives are better at delivering on than Labour, but also the Labour's home territory, which is how they're viewed on taxation, actually, and how they're viewed on currently the cost of living, where they are perceived to be able to deal with that better. But one other big issue a couple of years down the line is going to be this dynamic of reaching net zero, where cost of living crisis is perhaps still ongoing. And actually, there are some real distributional effects of the policies for net zero that government need to really think through. When we ask the public about how supportive they are of things like taking measures themselves, seeing government take measures and employers and organisations take measures to help meet net zero, they're very keen. When you explain some of the trade-offs from a lifestyle or an economic perspective, that keenness drops. And these are going to be some real big meaty issues that will come a cropper in the next election if they're not dealt with and tackled in the next period of time. So I think Keir Starmer, thinking carefully about other issues that he can play with are useful. I don't think the government will fly with your point on still banging on about vaccines, which was fantastic, obviously, but I think that ship will have sailed and people will have a view on government competency around the manifesto delivery a couple of years from now. But net zero, I think, will be, if that's what they play between now and then, levelling up net zero, the economy, will be big issues. And the NHS backlog.
Just very quick, on net zero, for it to become an election issue, it needs to be something where the Tories take one position and Labour take the opposing issue. I'd argue for it to be a big part of a campaign. And at the moment, you've got a great cleavage down the middle of the Conservative Party, where it's an argument between some of those at the top in the cabinet, between people in the cabinet and the party and at large in the top of the Conservative Party. But at the moment, I don't see, other than Labour promising to go a bit further and faster, the Conservatives keen to open up a party political divide on net zero. And that's why I left that one off my
Well, can I?
Just very quickly, because I do, there's lots of other questions to get through.
So I think, yes, it matters whether Labour oppose, but there are going to be other parties in the mix here, and they will have opposing views on the net zero issue, and they will be raising the impact around cost of living as well. And that bringing that voice, those other voices into the debate, so people like Reform UK, who will be those kind of parties, will raise it in the public psyche. And the issue is also there's an age divide on the net zero piece too, and that age divide matters for the Conservative Party voters.
It is interesting as well that there's a new sort of scrutiny watch group that's been set up in the Conservatives, the net zero watch on that. Just to continue this theme, Jeff, I mean, you made the point that sort of Brexit and Boris are very linked. Lord Adonis tweeted last week, if Boris goes, Brexit goes. Do you think he's right?
No.
And a follow-up question, fair enough, fair enough.
If only we could all be so succinct.
Yes, it would be very good. Michael has said, given that you know, you mentioned about the mass exodus of Labour voters, and lots of them went to the Lib Dems, the Greens, the SNP, why do you think Labour is only focused on winning back Brexit Tories?
Well, partly because the constituencies are important to them. There's a good return on terms of votes for constituencies, which they lost at the last election. And so they've got, you know, that's a crucial thing. And as for, I don't know, I mean, they share so much in common with the other ones that I think the talk is, well, like it was in the 1990s. We are back to the 1990s in some ways, when you got lots of tactical voting being set up and discussed and all the rest of it. You even had a referendum party and things like that. So it does seem quite kind of almost nostalgic. So I see Labour as targeting the enemy, as it were, and trying to think out ways of slicing up the competition effectively with the other people, but without compromising their own party integrity, which is always going to be a problem when it comes to doing deals.
Paula, Joe has messaged in saying, when you look back at 2019, was Brexit or Corbyn the largest influence? And what does this mean for the 2022 local elections? Because, of course, we are going to have the chance to have an interesting electoral test, our first big electoral test since 2019.
So I don't think you can easily separate Brexit and Corbyn into analytical categories and then say it was one or the other. You can do that to an extent with kind of quantitative analysis, but not very effectively. When you go to the focus groups, when people talk about this in their own words, those two things are run together so closely that you can't see them as analytically separate in people's minds. So I think they were both really important issues, and I wouldn't want to say one was more important than the other. I think, though, that to some extent both were symptoms of what was going on in the Labour vote as well as causes, and that goes back to that longer term point. The fact that Corbyn was leader and the fact that Brexit was the Brexit campaign was successful was part of that long-term structural change as well. So I think you need to see them as symptoms as well as causes. Obviously, neither of those are going to feature in the 2022 local elections, I don't think. Except, I suppose, there might be echoes of Corbyn in terms of some of the Labour vote shifting to other left-leaning parties, particularly the Greens. So I think we might see that in 2022, that some of the voters that were particularly keen on Corbyn's leadership might vote for the Greens in the local elections. I'm not convinced that would be replicated at a general election, as I was saying to you over lunch. I think that's a danger for Labour in the local elections, is that there is a significant shift to the Greens, which wouldn't be replicated in a general election, but will make the local election story much less positive for Labour than they are perhaps anticipating it's going to be. So I don't know if I failed to answer the question.
No, I think that's a fair point about that part of the left vote potentially swinging green, but also some potential Conservative voters swinging green as well in some seats. Sam, I mean, the local elections will be upon us soon. I mean, how important are these local elections going to be? How much is it a test for Keir Starmer as it is also for Boris Johnson?
First of all, I want to tell off everybody in the Westminster Village for framing the local elections in that way.
Because Northern Ireland is very important.
No, because
it's very important.
No, because local elections matter in of themselves, and there will be people voting because of their views one way or another about LTNs, the low pollution networks that either help or blight local communities, depending on whether you're a car driver or not. There are other many local election issues that really matter because, funnily enough, councils do play as, if not a bigger role in people's lives than politicians in Westminster. And I'm about to embark on a whole load of two-horse racery about the local elections, so I'm just getting the self-flagellation out of the way.
But having said that, turnout is low at these.
They are, and people choose not to engage with these issues, even though they make a big difference to them. And it is hard, and there are lots of consequences for that. But nevertheless, when you tune into Sky on the evening of, or probably the evening after, because counting often starts on the Friday now at local elections, what you'll see is an array of different things. So in England, the sort of three large clumps of things that are going on in the local elections is London boroughs are up, so the ones to watch for there are, does Westminster turn red for the first time? Could even Hillingdon Council, which of course has got Boris Johnson's constituency, Uxbridge, in its backyard, could that no longer be blue at the end of the evening? And that's an interesting one. I was in Hillingdon, in Uxbridge, in fact, at the end of last year, and talking to voters, and there was a lot of hostility then about parties and things like that. And I'm used to Boris Johnson being popular when I go on the street and people defending him, and that had changed even in his backyard. There are metropolitan councils that the Tories did quite well in the last point in the electoral cycle. Can they hang on? And there are some district shires where you've got the question about whether or not some of the sort of more pro-Remain bits of the Conservative Party continue to hang on. And then there's Scotland. There are some councils up there, so we'll be able to see whether or not the Conservatives are suffering from the fact that the Scottish Conservative Party, in the form of Douglas Ross, have essentially disavowed Boris Johnson, or does that work to their benefit? And can the Labour Party make any inroads against the SNP? So that'll be the conversation in Scotland. And then the conversation in Northern Ireland is multidimensional, but at its heart, the Assembly is going to be suspended, and the question is, does it get restarted by the election results? Can, if there's a Sinn Féin First Minister, there be a power-sharing arrangement that works, given that it seems quite difficult at the moment to see the DUP accepting a deputy First Minister job for one of theirs? Is there another possible configuration that might get the Assembly back up and running, or not? All of those things are to be determined, but the political future in Northern Ireland could be quite bleak. And then one of the big things that happens with local elections is about 24 hours after the voting closes, one of the sets of very, very esteemed academics comes up with what's just simply called the share of the vote. So there are the percentages that go at the bottom of your TV screens that tell you, roughly what the percentage of Labour votes was, percentage of Tories, and you compare them to the opinion polls, and you see whether the parties have done better or worse than we were expecting. So often, the narrative that dominates after local election results is not really based on what actually happened, but on these averaged out percentages that condition the conversation in the days that come.
And just in terms of the conditioning, the conversation, the narrative, I mean, the general election will be very different from local elections for a whole host of reasons. But the narrative, it can be quite a powerful one that comes out of local elections. Do you think there could, I mean, because the narrative right now is Partygate, this is going to be a chance for the public to sort of give Boris Johnson a boff on the nose, but it might not turn out like that. And if that is the case, that's going to be setting quite a very triumphalist narrative for Boris Johnson, but a very difficult narrative for Keir Starmer, his first test with the British public.
That's absolutely right. And the problem that we've got is twofold. First of all, these are, and I forgive, I'm sorry to say this because it'll come back to haunt me on election, but these are probably the least interesting of the cycle of local elections that you can get. Yet we will still try our best to read as much into them as possible. But there are quite a lot of unknowns, to be honest. So I'll give you one unknown. One of the things that you've obviously got everything that's going on in Ukraine, and the political conversation is different this week to what it was 10 days ago, simply because very, very serious events are going on, and quite rightly so. But one of the things we're also waiting for in the background is when do the police decide that they're going to announce their decisions around what went on in Downing Street and the Cabinet Office at the height of the pandemic. Now, that I would get my starting point is assuming that that's coming in about 3 weeks' time. So that would take us, to sort of the middle of March? Are we quite in purdah then? Are we not? Does that make a difference? Or could the police wait till the other side of the local elections? If we have the police verdict and then the local elections, and the police verdict is that Boris Johnson isn't personally fined, could the local elections therefore act as a moment where the Conservatives say, and it'll be contested, but the Conservatives say, well, that set of elections drew a line under that awful episode, we now move on? Or if the Partygate fines do come and they come after the local elections, they haven't been great, then that could be worse for the Conservatives. There are so many different kind of points down on the potential spider graph that it just depends on as much as anything else in the order that events come in the next few weeks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, Kelly.
Yes, I just wanted to come in on that, because the public's attention span for issues, it does move, and I think we're starting to see the move in some of our data coming through. So by the time we get there, if this Partygate and the Sue Gray report does drag out, as you say, Sam, it will re-energise that conversation with the public at that time. But at the minute, when we're looking at how the public are perceiving media coverage and what's too much, what's too little, 4 in 10 tell us too much on Partygate. 55% are telling us not enough on cost of living. That's what they're saying. We want to see more on some of the challenges that we face there. And I can't tell you the exact numbers because they're not out in the public domain yet. But for the first time ever in January, our issues index had as the second issue facing the UK today was trust in politics and politicians. We'd never seen it as high in that, just behind COVID-19 as a pandemic. Have a look when it comes out at how far it's dropped, even in a month. So I think the public's attention span for issues and where they will be feeling the pain and pressure when we come to those local elections may be also part of your media coverage at the time.
Yeah, and just to follow on from that, actually, Kelly, a message has come in saying about kind of issues and how they've changed. Someone's messaging asking a question about the salience of immigration, because they're saying, look, immigration dropped as an issue after the referendum, but will this change over time with more boats crossing the channel and the government's focus on this? Do you think that is an issue that you could see rising up your list again?
It's all relative. As you say, it did drop quite dramatically after Brexit. I think what we're seeing in the data at the minute is the public's view on how well the government have been dealing with the issue of immigration, which isn't particularly positive. So I think it will be a little bit about the volume of activity comparative to other big issues in the press, but then secondly, how effectively they think government are actually tackling that issue. So they think government's not doing a brilliant job on immigration, but same on things like levelling up, which were big party manifesto pledges at the time.
Okay, thanks for that. Lots of other questions to get through. An interesting one from Gareth, who's messaged in saying, this is picking up on Sam's point about Boris Johnson fighting the next election on his record on Brexit and vaccines. He's asking the question, isn't it normal for electorates just to bank things that the government have done and then move on, not reward them? Paula, what do you think about that?
I'm not quite sure how to think about that question, because we haven't had crises quite like these to deal with, so we don't quite know how these things are going to play out over time. We don't really know how the vaccine rollout has influenced voters. There's no complete agreement as to whether or not there was a vaccine bounce in the polling, whether or not the polling would have just been there anyway, whether or not the vaccine rollout is associated specifically with the government, or whether it's something people see as associated with the NHS, which they have very positive feelings towards already. So I don't know that these things are necessarily going to be attributed as successes to the government in the next election. I don't think we can. Obviously, every time he mentions it in the House, you assume Boris Johnson does think that.
Yeah. And there's a very strong attack line, isn't there, against Keir Starmer saying one of the reasons we got the vaccine rollout so quickly was because we left the EU, although that is contested. Jeff, I mean, what do you think about that? And also, is there any kind of correlation, I suppose, in terms of, in a way, attitudes to COVID being a bit like the attitudes to Brexit, being quite kind of defining things, and people being quite kind of steamed up about them?
Well, first on the earlier point, I mean, there's quite a lot of research that suggests that people really take the last year of a party's term of government into account more than the rest of it put together. So if they aren't going to go to an election until 23 or 24, I mean, COVID will be a memory that most people aren't factoring into their decisions. So I do think it'll just pass into history when it comes to voter decision making if they wait long enough. And I can't see them wanting to go soon and try and capitalise on say the vaccines, because as Paula says, you can interpret them in various ways, or you might want to emphasise on the death rates the year before or something like that if you're another party competing. So I do think we'll move on from that, because recency, myopic voting, the recency effect of voting decisions, the things they take into account, kind of important, and you're talking still 2 or 3 years down the line. So I think that's why I'm thinking that the Brexit thing, having realigned politics, will probably then slip into the background somewhat when it comes to what people are really worried about, and all the things about the NHS.
Backlogs.
And immigration is an interesting one, because there are some studies shows like third most salient concern, which it's never the top concern, to be honest, very rarely. But nonetheless, I mean, the Conservatives are not doing well on it, as you say, because they're struggling, but then again, there's no one competing on that, because effectively the other parties are all on the wrong side of the immigration debate anyway, because they're more supportive on the whole. And so I think that's not much of an issue because of that. So for me, Brexit, it's not, I didn't quite get your thing about Brexit being a defining issue. I think it was defining in the sense it helped to consolidate a period of political realignment.
Lots of people said, look, I don't see myself as left-wing or right-wing. And certainly lots of the phone-in shows I was doing, people were like, you're either a Leaver or Remainer. That's your kind of identity now.
And yes, in that sense, I think it's been a realigning sort of thing. It is a source of identity that's quite stable, and it's consequential. But as I was saying earlier, Tory party popularity is dropping in all types of Brexit, Leave or Remain voters, similar sorts of rates because of the current problems. So having sorted, I think they now react to new information, which will be, in the next few years, going to be kind of close to home.
Okay. Sam, you wanted to come in?
The question from the audience was, do voters bank things and move on and require something new, or could Boris Johnson return to the issues of Brexit and the vaccine rollout at the next election? And if I may, I'm going to disagree with the other panellists, because...
Oh, fight. We love it.
Because I don't think that Boris Johnson raises the issue of the vaccine rollout because he thinks that there is particular credit to be had in of itself on that issue now. I think he's doing it for another reason. There is going to be a fight at the next general election on the question of competence. There are going to be questions raised by the Labour Party about his ability to get things done. And he's going to have a challenge, which is that he went into the last election with a manifesto promising rather a lot when it comes to the subject, for instance, of levelling up. And a lot of the material, tangible change those changes are going to be put in train, but not necessarily come to fruition at the point of the next election. And a lot of people are going to ask Boris Johnson, where's the beef? And his answer to where's the beef is look at the vaccine rollout. Now, he's not answering it because he wants credit per se for that. He is using the vaccine rollout and Brexit being done to some extent in order to make the argument that he is capable and competent. So he's doing it for a slightly different reason. It's not about...
And just to follow on from that, is that another, I suppose, thread to that argument? Will he also say, look, depending on how things go, I got us out of COVID prison early?
Potentially, I think we're going to have to wait a little bit of time to find out whether or not that is an argument that works. Data around COVID is mixed. Perceptions around COVID are mixed. I think all of that isn't set yet. And I don't know how the politics of where people's heads are on COVID today plays out in 18 months' time.
Kelly, what are your thoughts on some of this?
So I agree that the public attitudes on COVID are not yet set. There's a lot of fluctuation. We're currently in field checking on people's views on COVID behaviours. Being at an event like this today, not wearing a mask, etc. How do people feel about that kind of thing, and how does it align with how they feel the Conservative Party are done? So I will let you know next week. Follow me on Twitter. But beyond that, levelling up's a really interesting one, because that was such a big part of we're going to level up the regions. There's been lavish amounts of policy attention and money spent on levelling up over the last 100 years, and nobody has quite managed it yet. And then the timing between now and the next election being called is going to make that a huge challenge for him. What we see in the data is public awareness of levelling up is low but rising. And what would make a huge shift perhaps to how people are feeling in the area is how they, rather than another infrastructure project or some large chunk of cash, feeling like they're getting their fair share, if that sentiment moved, and feeling like there were opportunities for young people in their area, those sentiments, soft things, if they shifted, people's perception of how government have dealt on levelling up may be movable in the short run, but it's not about another massive infrastructure project. They need to feel those things are better.
Okay, great. Final question, and kind of an interesting one, provocative one, but I think a salient one from Vijay. Why is there such a disconnect between academics, the Westminster liberal elite, I presume that's all of us here, the media and the public? Paul, I'm going to start with you.
I don't know quite what the questioner means by a disconnect there. So I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way, because one thing that we have been doing here is talking about the electorate as if they're a single group. What are the electorate's priorities? What do the electorate think about immigration? And actually, the electorate doesn't exist in those in that single group anymore. It is more fragmented. For example, taking the immigration issue, yes, if you look at the kind of headline figures, it might be fifth for Ipsos. I think it's fourth or fifth with YouGov. If you start to drill down into individual groups, there are some groups where immigration is the top issue. There's some group, I think it was the YouGov data, if you drill down into Leave voters, for example, it was the top issue. So I think actually, if you really want to understand what's going on with voters, whether I'm disconnected from them or not as an academic, you need to understand them in their situations, in their specific groups, and what their priorities and hopes are, because trying to understand them as a whole is almost impossible.
Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm kind of leaving off from what Paul has just said. Because politicians are overwhelmingly university-educated people from certain types of backgrounds, many of whom nowadays have got a professional career purely in politics. Academics are certainly university-educated people too, with lots of degrees and things like that. So it's fair to say that those groups probably can talk to each other sometimes, but if you're not a part of, say, a higher educated group and you don't share the language, values and assumptions of these sort of little subgroup elites, then you've got to feel cut off, probably. And of course, it's been a growing problem. Back in the 1980s or whatever, 1990s, we had a lot more people from, say, working class backgrounds in politics, a lot fewer people with degrees, especially on the Labour side. And so that changed, that homogenisation of the political world, which makes it look a little bit more like the academic world in some ways, and just perhaps the values that those people hold do remove them from some sections of society. So it's not the public as a whole, but it's fair chunks of the public who feel they're not being listened to.
Okay. Sam, any thoughts on that?
I think it's a brilliant question. I think people do feel disconnected from politicians. They do feel disconnected from the media. And it is not just important, but it is existential to our future on the media that we try really, really hard to address that. Because if we don't, then you'll switch off or you'll switch elsewhere. And so it is an urgent and continual task for me, for my colleagues at Sky and elsewhere, to put ourselves in different people's shoes, travel around the country, listen to different viewpoints, try and work out where people are coming from, because we've got it wrong in the past, right? And we've got to do better in the future. And we know that if we don't do better in the future, then the audience will dwindle to nothing and we won't have jobs.
Kelly, do you want to add anything to that?
Not a huge amount. Just, Paula, you are the most connected academic in terms of what the British public think. So don't put yourself down on that. It's why independent research organisations exist in many ways, to help bring the citizen public voice into the debate in politics. The biggest disconnect I see is between what happens on Twitter and what our research actually says, and I can tell you which one is better quality. Yes, exactly. So if I ever put anything out that's particularly controversial, I get absolutely rinsed on Twitter. So I think there are places where there are echo chambers, and Westminster can be sometimes considered to be one, which is why they try desperately to get their handle through focus groups and any other method on what the public actually thinks.
I think it's a great question, Vijay. Just my own story to end on this. I remember on the night of the EU referendum, was in the basement of the ITV building with lots of other commentators. One of my first sort of big commentating jobs, having left politics, and I was incredibly excited about it. And I sort of sat there with the great and the good of the commentators, and everybody was getting quite drunk. Like, everybody was like lashing into the red wine, and I was like on the water, and everyone's like, "What is going on? That's not like you." And I was like, well, you know, anything could happen. And I'm not going to name names, but literally the great and the good were like, took me aside and went, listen, you're new to this game. There is no way that Remain is losing. There's literally, it's just not possible. It's just not possible. So have a good time. We'll be in our cabs home by about 1 o'clock. And of course, it didn't. I only know this because I had actually gone out door knocking a lot in some Labour seats, and literally every door we knocked on said that they were planning to vote Leave and that immigration was a really big issue. So I was coming back into Westminster with a very different view, and I do always remember that night, because when the thing dropped, just watching the colour drain away from a lot of who were half cut by this point. You've never seen a room, mainly of men, sober up as fast and get typing. So yeah, there's a lot of disconnect, which we do all need to admit
Pretend
to.
to sober up.
Yeah, pretend to sober up. Well, look, thank you so much. It's been such an interesting discussion. My huge thanks to all the brilliant panellists. Thanks to you for all your great questions. It's been a thoroughly fascinating discussion. Thank you all very much.